All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are back with another episode of Around the Fire. And just as our ancestors used to sit around the fire to listen to one of the elders telling them about ancient African stories, here we are again, sitting around a symbolic fire to discuss events in African history. And of course, the aim is always to celebrate the victories of our ancestors, to be able to repeat their successes, and to avoid any errors that they may have made. So, Joanne, tell us, what are we talking about today?
Today, Professor S will be telling us about the Ebira people of Nigeria. Is that right?
Habari yako Mzoma.
Mzuri sana. What will you be telling us today?
Habari yako Litsela.
Habari yako, Prof.
All right.
Mzuri sana.
Yeah. Okay, I was just about to say, thanks for answering the question with a question. But all right, so and of course to all our listeners out there, habari yenyu, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, I do have to talk a bit about the Ebira people, but see, initially I planned to report on the Ebira people of central Nigeria, but when I looked up the information, what I found was a whole lot of info about the central Nigerian region, but not specific to the Ebira people. What I was able to locate is that the Ebira are believed to have come from the Igala people, and the Igala people are believed to be an offshoot of another ancestral tribe themselves. And I, as a matter of fact, I didn't write the name down because I knew I was going to butcher that one. But much of the history that's been reported or at least written down and able or available for us to find now has largely been about what happened in the region itself to not only them, but to their neighbors, as opposed to being just about them. Now, they did have a religion before Islam, and they are majority Muslim now, much like a lot of their neighbors, because even though they're in the center, their neighbors are they're right next to what's considered the north. And of course, they lived there from before there was ever a place called Nigeria. But they were initially, to tell the truth, there's more written about the people that harmed them. And when I say the people, I mean two specific rulers. There's more written about two specific rulers that harmed them than there were written about them. So starts off with the Fulani people being nearby them, and the Fulani had what you call the Fulani jihads. But there was a city called Kontagora, and it still exists today. Kontagora became an emirate, and there's a Fulani prince in history whose name was Umaru Nagwamatse, and he was from the same line that rules the Sokoto area. And the Sokoto is more famous, and that's why I mentioned them. Sokoto is easier even for people outside of Nigeria to know about. So he was from that same line. Well, they gave him this title, and when you translate it, it means king or commander of the blacks. And the one that gave him that title was himself entitled commander of the faithful. So it had a religious value to it that he was given this title, king or commander of the blacks. And see, at that time, there was no idea of political unity based on race in Africa, because people weren't usually referring to themselves as being black in Africa. That was something that non-Africans used to describe African people. Much like in Europe, they weren't walking around calling themselves white, but people outside of Europe would call Europeans white. So Umaru Nagwamatse started by conquering a people called the Kamberi. They were not Muslim, so nobody was really shocked that he would even want to do that. And that's when he found.
Prof.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I have to interrupt you before you continue. You said at the beginning there was a name that you didn't want to write down because you didn't want to butcher it. Mm-hmm. What name is that?
I think it's called the Jukun. I believe they were referred to as the Jukun people. But
are those the same people as the Ibra people?
No, apparently the Ibra came from the Igala, and the Igala people came from, I believe they came from the Jukun. But the thing is that I saw the name written, but I never heard anybody pronounce it. And that was why I initially refrained from saying it. So it's spelled Jukun.
All right. Okay. No, that's clear. All right. Sorry, you can continue.
It's all right. It makes perfect sense. I mean, that's what I'm here for. I want the questions.
All right.
In this case, I actually do want the questions, because even if it's something that I couldn't find, an audience member might be able to find it and then bring us up to speed in the comments section later on. So whatever questions come to mind, go ahead and ask. Because the worst thing that happens is that I don't know, but somebody comes in later on in the comments and knows and tells us.
Yeah, sure.
And
while we're still here, are you gonna tell us why specifically he was called the King of the Blacks? I mean, Nagwamatse.
Even though they didn't have a concept of a racial or a racial unity, the reason Sarkin Sudan, that was the Fulani title given in their language, Sarkin meaning ruler of or commander of. And by this time they were Muslim, so there were many words that they were using from Arabic as well. They used, of course, they spoke Fulani, but some of the some words they used coming out of Arabic. And as a matter of fact, they were known to have written using the Arabic alphabet, but they were still writing in their own language. And Sudan today, we understand it as the East African nation south of Egypt that borders the Red Sea. But at that time, initially, Sudan literally means land of the blacks. It's like a plural form of the plural form of black. And so this was.
I have a question. Was it called land of the blacks because of the complexion? Because if you look at Sudanese as it is, especially the Southern Sudanese, they're the darkest set of Africans we have in terms of complexion.
Even at a time when the Arabs were black, generally speaking, people coming from the continent would be somewhat darker. So even if you were looking at a black Arab, you take someone coming out of the continent at that time, and they would have still have been darker than people on the eastern side of the Red Sea. So a lot back from what I've been able to gather and piece together is that people generally would describe shade based on comparison more than they were into using an objective name for it. So that's why it is that they would call the Romans white. The Romans didn't walk around calling themselves white, and a lot of Roman citizens, as the empire expanded, were not what we would call white today. But you still had people that even between black folks, there would have been those who, if they were on average darker, then they would have been called black by other people that today we would also call black, because the concept of race was more comparative back then than it is today.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, especially if the name was given by the Greeks, the Greeks or the Romans, because it seems like throughout history, it's the Romans that tend to give other people names. They definitely would have referred to the people living on the African continent as black, right?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Even Kemet is translated to mean land of the blacks in its own language, in the old Medu Neter language. So a lot of people really, this is one phenomenon that is somewhat odd. A lot of people got their names from somebody else.
Yeah, that's true. That's right.
So many people did. And so if even today, a lot of nations have their names from someone else. And we even have continents named after other people at this point, or named by other people. If you look at the Americas in general, that's named after a guy named Americo Vespucci, an Italian fellow. So a lot of people didn't think of their own names by which they were going to be recorded down in history. So that's why it is that Africa in general would have been called land of the blacks, and then different nations within would have had similar names with similar meanings. And the more ancient they were, the more this trend seems to be the case. Even Nigeria and the nation next to it, Niger, they come from black. which is why they're similar to the N-word. It's not, and it wasn't an epithet at the time, but they were given these names because Nigeria is not an African name. It's taken out of Latin, and so was Niger. It's just the French version of that Latin word for black.
Yeah.
And so same thing happened with Ethiopia. The Egyptians called it, the Greeks called it Ethiopia, land of the burned faces. They called it Abyssinia. And Abyssinia was supposed to mean people of darkness in some of their own languages. And also the Arabs called it Habesha, which in their language meant a multitude of colors.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So
yeah. Anyway, we don't want to derail you. Yeah.
It's all right. I won't tell anybody. I'll keep it a secret.
Please.
Yeah. But they, so he started this town called Umaru started this town called Kontagora, and that became his capital city. Now, here's the funny thing. He was already about 57 or 58. This was in 1864 that he did this. And so up until about 1876, he would just conquer one place after another, and he would take the captives. And most of these places were nearby, so they were in the center. And he depopulated. So he became infamous for depopulation of what's now central Nigeria. So there was a slave trade, of course, but it was more profitable to trade within the continent and two places in the Americas, because we know about the transatlantic trade. But by that time, 1864, by that time, the transatlantic slave trade was already illegal in the US. It had already been illegal, I think, from 1820. And then on top of that, 1864, the Civil War was underway. So in another year, slavery was about to become illegal throughout the United States. On top of that, a lot of other places in the Americas had already outlawed slavery. So you had Cuba and Brazil that were profitable if you were going to sell people to the coast. So at that time, when he started, it was still some profitability to that slave trade. So if he took slaves from the region, or let's say he took captives of war first, then it didn't just mean that they would be marched next door and absorbed into the Fulani people that fought them. That the place could be depopulated, and he did do that. It got so bad that some of the walled cities were empty, and they're still empty up until today. Cities that had walls around them wound up being empty. And then when later on the British government tried to repopulate them shortly before Nigerian independence, they couldn't do it because the areas were just in ruins and nobody was going to stay in them for very long and build them up. But in 1880, Umaru had a son named Ibrahim Nagwamatse from before, not 1880, but in 1880, that's when Ibrahim began to rule. And Kontagora became notorious for slave raiding and depopulation. And so some people even remember Umaru and Ibrahim, the father and son, as if they're the same person named Nagwamatse, even though Nagwamatse was their surname. So, people that read history will know the difference, but some people that just hear it, they just hear the name Nagwamatse and they think it's one person.
Yeah, it's easy to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what wound up happening. So some people, even when I first heard about it, the person that told me talked about Nagwamatse as one person that depopulated. What I was able to find out later on was that really nobody kept record of exactly what happened to all of the people that were captured in war. So we know that there were actually, some were kept amongst those who captured them, and then others were dispersed in all directions. And as a matter of fact, there's a population in Egypt today that traces themselves back to central Nigeria, to the Ebira people, and,
wow,
to their neighbors. I found that out just less than an hour ago. So apparently it's not one fate that awaited them, but it was several fates, and nobody sat up and took note of which percentage of the people went through exactly which fate. But what did happen was that central Nigeria got largely depopulated, and that made it easier for the Fulani imperialism wound up making it easier for the British imperialism to succeed.
All right, Prof. Before you go on with that point, I'm struggling a little bit with something here. The Fulani, during this period, are they part of are they like an empire? Are they part of which empire, if they are? Is it the Sokoto Empire or is that a different empire?
Well, the Sokoto Emirate would have been part of the larger Fulani jurisdiction. The thing is that the Fulani are not all identical, and even politically they were not. Matter of fact, there's some Fulani that aren't even Muslim, and other Fulanis tend to forget that they were even Fulani. One group is called the Wadabe. I think they're atheists. If I'm not mistaken, they have no belief in an afterlife. And other Fulani tend to forget that they are from the same origin. Most Fulani are Muslim, but politically speaking, they actually had different emirates, and the emirates were not, they weren't always centralized.
Okay.
So it was more like they had different emirates that bounded each other, as opposed to having one central Fulani empire.
Okay. So Umaru and Ibrahim, which emirate do they come from?
They came from the same.
Sokoto.
Yeah, they were related to the ones that ran the Sokoto Emirate.
Oh, okay, okay.
And so Ibrahim, he actually made one mistake in 1899. He took this town called Benin Gwari, and I don't know what ethnicity the majority of the people in Benin Gwari were, but the city had an emir. The ruler of the city was called an emir, so it would have been considered an emirate, which means these were largely Muslims. So he was going and taking Muslim lands and conquering other Muslims. So that city's emir, and I didn't get his name, but he had to ask for British protection, and that put Benin Gwari under the British control, or kind of. It certainly put him under British control, and it put his followers under it. So even though Ibrahim took it, he then, because of the protection that was given to Benin Gwari and to that city's emir, Ibrahim threatened the British military post in the next year, 1900. So the British responded, and it was a guy named Lugar, I believe, a British general named Lugar. The British responded, and they just went into Kontagora, and they took it, they occupied it, and they deposed Ibrahim. They put him out of office. And the thing was that on one hand, Ibrahim was the only one that really stood up to Lugar, or the only one recorded to have actually stood up to Lugar. But by the same token, he wound up losing. And when he was out of power, the people didn't necessarily listen directly to Lugar or his authorities, because they weren't going to listen to the British. They were Muslim, and they weren't going to listen to a non-Muslim tell them what to do, regardless of race. But nonetheless, eventually they had to approach Ibrahim and say, listen, you go back in and you rule. So they put him back in power in 1903, but it was less power. And so that's how the British realized that they were going to have to rule the northern part of Nigeria with an indirect system. See, in the South, they ruled directly. They were the state. In the North, they had to rule indirectly, because they found everything that a state needed at that time in the North. And I don't mean a state, they found multiple emirates, but they had to rule each one of these emirates indirectly through the local rulers, because there was already a system in place. And so the people were not going to just transition from what they had straight into the British system. It would have caused anarchy anyway. And so
somehow then Ibrahim Nagwamatse and his father had contributed to the South not having strong independent states at that time.
Well, they contributed to the center. I never found anything about them going into the South specifically.
No. I meant the center. I meant it is the center where the Ebira people are.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
They contributed to the center not having much of a defense. And that would have contributed to the North not having much of a defense, because the British were going to expand. But had there been a bigger population in the center, then the British would have had to, take a different approach. So by the time the North would have, by the time they reached the North, they would have already been weakened by the center if they could have even gotten through to it, because they would not have been able to be as slick with it. But because in of the taking of Birnin and the depopulation from even before that, the British, when they were requested for protection, they didn't really have to fight a whole lot of people when they marched through with their military. It wasn't just traders that had, at this point, you didn't just have businessmen and traders marching through. They were able to go through with the military through the center and set up a post, I think in the center of it, but not far from the north. And so that did change the outcome, because we know the British were imperialists. They were more imperialist than the Fulani. I mean, at this point, they already had a bunch of colonies. And in 1900, this was after the Berlin Conference. It was 16 years after it. So the imperialism of Europe was pretty well known by anybody that had contact with Europeans. And so, yeah, it did change things. The way that these two acted really did change things. And it took away even later on their own defense, and it allowed the North to be just as colonized as the South was at that time through the center.
Yeah.
And so
that's sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's an important piece of information, because when you look at what aided colonization of Africa, it's one of those things. It's the fact that, but you have already talked about how there was no racial solidarity before the advent of colonization, and perhaps because there was no need, there wasn't a need for Africans to solidify in terms of race, because there was no outside threat before the advent of colonization. But that lack of racial solidarity, it seems then that it's one of the things that make colonization possible when it happens.
It is.
Eventually.
Yeah, it certainly is. The thing is that, in all honesty, the Europeans were not necessarily as unified then as they are now. That they had to have a conference pretty much because they weren't unified, and they were having a conference to avoid wars. They were pretty much saying, we're not buying this land, so let's just go ahead and agree to not fight each other over these particular portions. But the thing was that other groups of people, it wasn't just Black folks, but other races of people, they just didn't beat whites to the punch when it came to a racial common defense, I should say, because you're not going to have a whole lot of unity when cultures are really that different. But in terms of a common defense, Europe met and agreed on a common offense before any other race met and agreed on a common defense. And Africa was not, we tend to think that we're the least unified race on the planet, and that's not really true. But we're one of many that did not beat the Europeans to the punch. And that's what we see here. The British were going to do that. They were at least going to try. But there was something else important in this too. And that is that even, the initial Fulani jihads centuries before this time, they were about the proselytization of the faith and expanding the Muslim legal system, the Islamic legal system, politically speaking. We don't make any apologies for that. I mean, some people say we spread Islam by the sword. Personally, that's not true, because you can't force a conversion. Everybody understands that. Politically speaking, there was in fact an empire, and empires seek to expand their boundaries by force. Nobody's ever apologized for that. So we shouldn't be the first to do it. However, the purpose was supposed to remain that. And later on, you had them beginning to try to expand the boundaries for the sake of self-glorification and just pure de-imperialism and even materialism. And when that happened— I
have a question.
Yes.
Do you think is Islamism, like, they also contributed towards slavery like Christianity did? Because if you look at all the books we've read, I think, or rather on this side of East Africa, they only talked about mostly about Christianity and the spread of slavery. Christianity were they were the slave drivers, Christians in short. So what, Muslims the same?
It would seem like that. And to be honest with you, there isn't such a thing as, now one of the major differences that you can say that the Europeans escalated their enslavement of other people after they became Christian. Arabs, there was an Arab slave trade, that's true. And you could say an Indian Ocean slave trade in general. However, that actually would have been scaled back after Islam. The religion itself does not outlaw slavery, nor does it promote it. It's promoted to free the slave on an individual level. That's actually a promoted thing to do. And that's why it is that, to be honest with you, it precedes any ideas of abolition that European Americans later on came up with in fairly early in US history. And even before the US became independent, there were abolitionists, but they were preceded actually by the system of Islam itself. Now, when you start talking about Bedouin arrogance, that's altogether different. Arabs actually were not able to do a lot of raiding in Africa for slaves. They did go in and enslave, but they weren't able to do a lot of raiding for slaves. They were more likely to go in and buy who they could, and then sometimes they would raid depending on where the location was. Because we have to remember, they were not naturally immune to malaria any more than Europeans were. Because the peninsula, very little of the peninsula is actually tropical and humid. So they would have, if they had actually been these slave raiders that we think of and these sword-wielding occupiers of Black Africa, then actually malaria would have wiped them out if that were the case, just like it did to the Europeans until quinine was developed. So they really weren't capable of doing what we think they did, but they did participate in their own slave trade as Arabs, not so much specifically as Muslims. Now, the slave trade, I don't know how many they killed. That I'm not sure of. What I do know is that most of the Muslim lands did not economically rely on slavery to the same extent that the European colonies in the Americas did. Their economies were built on it, especially the US's. The US became the richest country in the world, specifically by stealing land by force from the original Americans and then taking labor for free from the Africans that they kidnapped because they couldn't enslave the original Americans. So they became the country we know of today. And I'm saying this as an American. They became the country that we know today specifically because of that. If I'm a drug dealer and I'm just going up and down the block and there are no police, I'm selling drugs, I'm going to have the money. Then I'm going to have the weapons. Then I can just take everybody's house from them if I want to and make them do what I want because there are no police around. And of course, I'm cheating to get ahead financially. And after I enslave some people, I got free labor. I'm definitely going to get ahead. If they have any skills and I don't pay them for it, I'm going to get ahead. Before you know it, I'm going to be the richest guy around for miles. And then people are going to feel like they have to at least pretend to respect me, and that's what happened here. So in terms of Arabs, yeah, they had a slave trade. They were more likely to purchase than to raid. They did both. But in terms of a Muslim slave trade, there was nothing that tied that trade to the religion, whereas the Europeans actually tied the slave trade to their religion. That's what a difference.
Wow.
Is.
Yeah.
So.
And well, now back to the Ebira. Do you find that at any point in history they try to defend themselves against Umaru or Ibrahim Nagwamatse, or they could not put up any form of defense?
I'm sure that they did fight back, but I wasn't able to find much information on specific strategies that they used. It doesn't appear that the Fulani were going to write down what they encountered, and it appears that the Ebira people just simply didn't write them down, and it doesn't seem to have been passed on orally to any non-Ebira people or Ebira people. I may be pronouncing Ebira incorrectly, but it doesn't seem to have been passed on orally to anybody that's not an Ebira. I did meet an Igala man here, and apparently the Ebira came from the Igalas, but as I stated earlier, but there was certain information even he didn't know, because by the time that this was going on, the Ebira had already become distinct from the Igala. And so the passing on would not have been in that direction per se, because they would pass it on. The oral history would be passed on to their own descendants. I haven't found an Ebira yet where I live. That's exactly what I would ask them if I If I met one here that's Ebira, I would ask them the same thing. What type of, what, as far as what's been passed on, what were the resistances that you all used? So I'm sure that they did resist. I just couldn't find any information out about how they resisted or any specific specificities of their resistance.
Yeah, they would certainly have tried to resist. It's only natural. And do you know if they also, I mean, the emirate and the Nagwamatse, do you know if they also make slaves out of the Fulani people themselves? Or target non-Fulani people at this point?
Yeah, I haven't found anything out about them, and I've met several Fulani. They, the ones I've met actually speak Hausa. They don't speak Fulani, but they are in fact Fulani. They have not made any mention about enslaving other Fulani. They didn't even mention enslaving the Wodabe, but the ones I met don't live near the Wodabe people, which are like a sub-tribe of the Fulani, genetically speaking, not culturally. They haven't made any mention of that. Now, one thing that was generally avoided, and this is the turning point. We're not supposed to enslave our own. Even in war, if we wind up fighting a war with each other, which we're not supposed to do, we're not supposed to enslave each other. So I'm not supposed to take a free Muslim and then put him in bondage. But the problem here was that we're not really supposed to get into wars with each other either. And Umaru, and especially Ibrahim, broke that rule, which shows that they had some kind of motive that was not pure. And this is a lesson for us. This is something that's happened to us Muslims again and again. When we break these rules, we pay for it. We don't get away with this. And so that was actually part of how he was able to, of how the British were able to come in. Lugard was able to come in and then start in on the north. I mean, you notice Ibrahim sends a threat. Don't protect him. Much like when you and I were teaching, I would tell certain students that were good, don't protect that student that I caught cheating. And you might have heard me tell this to them. He sends a threat and they respond by going in and invading Kontagora right off the bat. That means they were just looking for a reason. That's what that means. They were just looking to see who's going to be the most bellicose, and we're going to focus our forces on them, and we'll do this one at a time. And so a similar thing happened. This is not the first time this lesson has been learned by us. Something like this happened even before, and that was in Spain. When we ran Spain, it advanced, it developed, it became the most developed place in Europe. What happened was that when some of the emirs in Spain of different provinces began to side against each other, then they began to aid the Reconquista. Well, we know what happened after the Reconquista. After the Reconquista, it ended when Christopher Columbus marched into Granada. That's why he had the influence with King Ferdinand and Queen Elizabeth to even ask for the money he asked for to go across the Atlantic. They first told him no, but he was the general that marched into Granada and kicked the last ruler out, last Muslim ruler out. And this was about January the 2nd or 3rd, he did this, of 1492. Later, the fall of that year, that's when he made the trip across the Atlantic. And you know, everybody knows the atrocities that happened to the original Americans. And that was largely because it was indirectly due to when we weren't doing what we were supposed to do in Spain. Started fighting with each other, bickering, started developing ulterior motives that were of a lower vibration. And because of that, neither the Americas nor the continent nor the Middle East nor many other parts of the world have ever recovered. Everybody's wound up having to pay for it since then. And that's what happened in this case too. They developed some ulterior motives, and somebody picked on the wrong one, forced them to take refuge with the British. And then the British had the excuse they need to go in. And then before you know it, the Fulani, who used to rule themselves, even if it was decentralized, now indirectly, at least, they got to take orders from the British, and they have their rulers installed and approved of by the British.
Yeah, and that's a good excuse for the British when they come in to the Fulani and those areas and the north, to use the excuse that they came to protect some Africans, I believe, like the Ebira against the Fulani even.
Exactly. Now that particular city that was invaded in 1899, Birnin Gwari, I don't know what the ethnicity is of the emir there, or what the predominant ethnicity is, because there were areas that were in fact mixed, and it was not uncommon even at that time for some people to live in someone else's predominantly ethnic area, at least temporarily. So I don't really know even what the predominant ethnicity of Benin Gwadi is yet. What I do understand is that once he sought the protection of the British and they gave it, that was, whether he was Ebira or Igala or whatever his ethnicity was, you're right, it did give them the excuse. And that's what mattered to them, just like it mattered to the French, to the Portuguese, to the Spaniards. That's always been the case. Even Cortez, when Cortez took the Aztec Empire by taking the capital Tenochtitlan, he had a confederation of other original Americans that were victims of the Aztecs. They had a beef with the Aztecs, and so he was able to go in and with this confederation, he would not have been able to take Tenochtitlan without two things. One was the fact that the diseases that he carried and his men carried, they went through the capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. They went through the capital and they put the population, in 2 years, the population was about half. So the fighting force was also about half of what it was when he first met them 2 years before he fought them. And the other reason was that he had people that were not Aztec that said, yeah, we got a beef, we got a grudge with them. They've been doing us wrong and we'll help you to overthrow them. It's the same thing here. So the Aztec, I mean, they were sacrificing people, and I think they were probably sacrificing Aztecs and non-Aztecs. But if you take the Fulani, I mean, they weren't engaging in human sacrifice. But the truth is that the rulers, not so much every Fulani, but you had these rulers that they just became materialistic or imperialistic, and they gave the British that excuse. And when they say divide and conquer, they don't go in always and start a new division. Maybe if they have to, they will. But if they can find one, it's already there. That's always much easier.
Because didn't the Ebira or Ibra, depending on I don't know which one it is, but I guess that's used interchangeably. Didn't they become a protectorate of Britain at some point? Yeah. While you answer that, I'm looking at the time. I think we've gone over 40 minutes now. We need to start wrapping up.
Okay, yeah. From what I see, we've gone right at 40. Yeah, from what I see right now, we're right at it. To answer that, they did become not so much just by themselves a protectorate, but rather the land. It wasn't so much the Ebira people that did, but rather the land that they occupied, that became a protectorate along with the rest of Nigeria. Of course, Kontagora wound up becoming such. They had to put Ibrahim in power 2 times. They reinstalled him twice. I'm not sure what happened between 1903 and 1906, but 1906 was the second time they put him back in power. The British did. But Kontagora doesn't have any of the same state or political borders except the city of Kontagora has, of course, its city limits. But that the area, the emirate itself, it doesn't have any, there's no political boundary like a state border or a district border that marks it separate from everything else. Now it's just a part of Niger State. And so if it became a protectorate, of course, the center did. So yeah, it became the whole of what's now Nigeria wound up becoming a protectorate. If you want to call a protectorate a colony. Yeah, they all of it did. The center, the north, of course, the south was probably so by this point anyway. But yeah, all of it wound up becoming a protectorate.
Wow. Wow. So do you think the British advancement or the arrival of the British and the eventual colonization of what is now Nigeria, could it have been avoided, do you think, or was it an unavoidable occurrence?
That would really depend on where we start talking. I'm sure there was a point of no return when The way that it could have been avoided that I know of would have been that as soon as the Danish and the Portuguese showed up, then especially the Portuguese, then they would have had to be kept on the coast to trade with. You know what? No, now that I think about it, absolutely not. I don't think it could have been prevented. Because once quinine was developed, and it was developed either at the end or shortly after the American Civil War, but once quinine was developed as a medicine or utilized as a medicine against malaria, no, there was not much that could have been done. Maybe the North could have saved itself, but yeah, maybe they could have, but I don't think they would have even been able to save themselves permanently. To be honest with you, even the two parts of the continent that remained uncolonized when all the rest were being colonized, I don't believe they could have stopped it. I don't think that Liberia would have been able to resist the colonizing effort by England. And I don't think that, in all honesty, Ethiopia did put up a resistance, but if things had been slightly different, I think they would have been completely colonized too, not only occupied, but outright colonized. In all honesty, I don't think that if it hadn't been for the fact that he was able to, the ruler of Ethiopia was able to utilize the grudges between Europeans and get support from Japan as well, I don't think they would have been successful in keeping them out. They would have made it difficult and probably very expensive. I think a lot more Italians would have died trying. But yeah, a slight change of things and they could have taken it. So I'm not sure if anybody could have avoided it, really.
Yeah, I don't know how that makes me feel.
Well,
I don't think, I do not think it could be avoided in any part of Africa, especially with what we had then and what we knew then. Yeah.
Well, I heard a man in my hometown say that one of the major mistakes that the continent made was not developing firearms. I do believe that weapons were a major game changer. I do believe that. Because
yes, I believe that too.
But
yeah,
the Europeans had superior weapons.
Absolutely. But in terms of using iron itself as weapons, I do believe that we had the capacity. If it wasn't firearms, we could have responded to the initial presence of Europeans and the initial encroachment of Europeans with weapons advancement. If we had focused on that, we probably could have held them off, but we would have had to become similar to them in order to do it.
Yeah.
I think that's the best place to wrap up today. What do you think, guys?
Well, I'm just gonna, I'll wrap up when you all don't have any more questions.
Yeah, we don't, I don't have any more questions. Do you, Mariri?
No, I think we've covered pretty much most of the points we needed to cover. We can continue the discussion, of course, on in the comments with the audience.
Well, that leads to the last question, the perfect one to wrap up with, and that is, who's presenting next week and what is the topic?
I am presenting next week, and I will introduce you to my people, the Luo people, who are also Nilots. So,
wow,
it will be the best topic you'll ever hear of, because I'm sure, being that these language groups really are mostly taught on the eastern part of Africa and not on the other parts of Africa. So there'll be a lot for you guys to learn.
I'm looking forward
to it.
And
yeah,
Oma, be ready for a whole lot of questions from me here.
Oh my Lord. I will be ready.
All right. And with that being said, I'll say to the audience.
That's extra black.
And yep. With that being said, I'll say to the audience, Asante Sana, for tuning in and listening. And we look forward to you all coming back next week. And if you have any answers to the questions that we're not able to find, please feel free to leave an answer in the comments. And for the sake of Professor Litsela and Dr. Oma, they told me not to use those titles, but for the sake of them, hit that.
Yeah, we are going to edit that.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Okay. And I'm going to come back and record it again. So for their sake, audience members, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the like button and the share button. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Inshallah.